already be recording. So
no, we got
I
it.
don't know, maybe.
We got it.
Okay.
We got the recording. It's happening.
Okay, great.
All right.
Perfect.
Okay. Lyla June is here. Excellent. Welcome and welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. And just to remind everyone, we are recording this conversation today, and we welcome you all here very warmly. My name is Carrie Norton, and I'm here joined by several esteemed women. But I want to just take a moment before we dive into some very brief introductions and context setting for today's conversation. I want to just take a moment to invite us to ground ourselves and to really be present for this conversation, which is one of a kind. So I want to just invite everyone to arrive into the room and feel free to take a couple of deep breaths. And remember why you're here. Remember why you have joined this important dialogue. And I just invite you to be present for everything that you will hear today and find ways to really listen in the deepest possible way to the wisdom of these three women, and listen with a lens of how you can take this back into your own work and lives, and how you can embody the spirit of this wisdom as you move through the world. And remember that we are all sitting on land, very likely that was inhabited by other people. And so as we consider our legacies and lineages, let us also bring the spirits of those who came before us along with us as we move through our work in our lives. So thank you. So with that being said, I want to just take a moment, since I imagine there are several folks who have not participated in one of these dialogues before. I just want to make a quick introduction. Again, my name is Carrie Norton. I am joined here by my colleagues Carolina Carvalho and Felicia Chavez, who are who form our three-legged stool here of the system of systems thinkers. And we have aspirations for the world of systems thinking, that it can become more collaborative and really serve the world in the way that systems thinking intends to. So that's the system of systems thinkers. And we were inspired last year during the 50th anniversary celebration of Limits to Growth, authored by the lead author of that book being Diné Meadows. That was the celebration of that anniversary of her work and the work of her colleagues. 50 years, let's think about that. 50 years since that book was written, and since those ideas really took the world by storm. And here we are 50 years later and asking ourselves many of the same questions. So we were inspired to bring women's voices into the fore, to continue the conversation that Diné offered the world, and to continue to be inspired by her ideas. And I just want to say that we are standing on the shoulders of giants. In the first series, Women in Systems Thinking speaker series, that you all are welcome to watch, it's recorded. We'll share the links to that. But we were absolutely honored and moved that so many illustrious women in the field of systems thinking joined us for that dialogue series last year. And again, I invite you and encourage you to watch all of those recordings. So that set the table. And we heard from all of you that you would like to continue that conversation, the conversation with women, by women, in service to all of humanity and to all of life. So that's what brings us here today. And I could not be more proud and honored to be kicking off this year's dialogue series with these three remarkable women. Ingraham, Riane Eisler, and Lyla June. And I just get chills thinking about the fact that this is the triumvirate that's going to kick off our series this year. And really grateful to them for setting the tone for this year's dialogue series, and grateful to all of you for being here. And I'm not going to read their bios, but we have furnished them on our website, and we will share updated bios with you as well, more comprehensive bios. But suffice it to say that these women are giants in the field of women's advancement, women's leadership, feminist principles, Indigenous principles, partnership, et cetera. I could go on, and they are all they're published authors, they're dialogue hostesses and hosts, and they are really moving the needle for women and for all of humankind and for all of life. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Eli to begin this dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eli.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. That was such a lovely invitation to be present and introduction. So we are so pleased to kick off the second Women in Systems Thinking Dialogue series. And personally, I am so pleased to host my friends, colleagues, and sisters in the cause, Riane Eisler and Lyla June Johnston. So welcome, Riane and Lyla June. And today's discussion is going to focus on the role of partnership values in systems thinking through the lens of economics. And we hope to illuminate pathways toward greater cooperation between various schools of systems thinking. We're grateful to all women systems thinkers for advancing a more inclusive and holistic worldview. So thank you for this forum. I want to start on the idea of narrative and story, because most of the world grows up hearing a narrative of humanity that says we are inherently greedy, competitive, and uncaring, even violent. And these narratives shape our lives and our worldview. And so, Riane and Lyla June, I would love for each of you to share the human story that you grew up with, and then share what the turning point was that made you question everything and then decide to work on whole systems change. So Riane, would you get us started with that?
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Welcome. And I'm delighted to really help to launch this second in the series of Women Systems Thinkers. Well, the narrative I grew up with is the same narrative that most of us grew up with. Yeah, that we're just awful, you know, whether it's original sin or whether it's selfish genes, it's really the same story, even though they fight each other. It's we're bad, we're innately bad, that's just how it is. And so naturally, we need to be controlled from the top down, right? Well, the passion that I have for really debunking this story and for really finding out what can we do so that we have a better world is deeply rooted in my childhood as a child refugee from the Nazis with my parents from the Holocaust, really. On Crystal Night, a gang of Gestapo men, some Austrian, some German, broke into our house, dragged my father away. So I had the trauma of witnessing insensitivity, violence, destructiveness. But I also saw something else that night, and it's what I today call spiritual courage. And it was the courage of my mother to stand up and demand, really. She recognized one of the men who came as a young Austrian who had been an errand boy for the family business. And she got furious. She said, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so good to you? I want him back." Now, she could have been killed. I mean, many Jewish people were killed that night. But by a miracle, she wasn't. By a miracle, she did obtain his release. And by a miracle, we were able to leave my native Vienna at night and eventually get to Cuba. So, but witnessing this caring, you know, the spiritual courage which is the courage to stand up against injustice out of love. It's not the courage to slay the dragon or whatever we're taught courage really is, you know, in domination, in what I call domination systems, led me to questions about, does it have to be this way? When we humans, as I saw in my mother, and I saw, you know, in other people, have this enormous capacity for sensitivity, for caring, really for love, for consciousness. Why has there been so much insensitivity, so much uncaring, cruelty, so much destructiveness? Is it, as we're told, you know, as I was told, inevitable, you know, either divinely or naturally ordained, or is an alternative, or is there an alternative? And it was really after many other experiences, including working for the Systems Development Corporation, way back before the term systems analysis was a household word, so to speak. And law school and family and having children and marriage and divorce, but I really tried to answer this question. And I saw right away that I couldn't answer it using the conventional social categories. You know, Einstein said it. He said, we can't solve problems with the same consciousness, the same thinking that created them. Also, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist, really fragment our consciousness. I mean, first of all, if you think about them, none of them, you know, there have been terrible regimes in every one of these categories. So none of them tell us what we can build that is a better alternative. And yes, all of them marginalize or just ignore nothing less than the majority of humanity, women and children, and hence families. So it is really what we have inherited is not systems thinking. And I think I'll stop at this point and give Lyla and also Eli a chance to go further and to be continued.
Thank you. Thank you, Riane. It's such a compelling story. And every time I hear you say it, I learn new details about it. I just really loved the expression spiritual courage, as you described your mother standing up to injustice out of love. And so often I think we are familiar with the whole idea of standing up to injustice, but to kind of remember that it actually comes out of a love for humanity, you know, not just sort of being angry. So, you know, God love women who have always stood up that way. So Lyla June, moving to you, you often talk about humanity or humans being a keystone species. And so I'd love for you to answer the earlier question, but also sort of tie in this idea of humans being a keystone species in your answer, if you would.
Yes, certainly. And can you hear me okay? Okay, great. I got I'm visiting family in northern New Mexico, and I got a hotel just for this call, and the internet wasn't as good as I hoped, but it looks like it's working. So thank you, Creator, for that. Yes, first of all, it's lovely to be here with my friend Riane and with you, Eli, and all of you. And lovely to discuss this and hopefully give us some tools to really use in our lives. So with me, yes, I think I was sort of spoon-fed the notion that, you know, misanthropy, that humans are just a pest, they're a problem, they're always messing things up, they're always polluting. And also in my childhood, it starts, you know, I had a family member who was always just bad-mouthing humanity and lifting up animals like deer and bear and buffalo and eagle. And these were like, the binary was like, animals are sacred and humans are profane. And so I grew up with that, but I too wondered, is this how it has to be, you know? And this family member, which was severely misanthropic, which just means detests humans and avoids them, I was really, sometimes we're inspired by family members in the other way, like we want to do the opposite of what they do instead of what they do. So that's how I'm grateful for this family member, to showing me just how toxic self-hatred can be, hating ourselves as humans, and really wanting to flip the script a little bit, or interrogate it as, is this how it has to be? And so what I found was astounding. I just finished my PhD in Native American food systems and Native American land management techniques. And what I found was, dozens and dozens and dozens of ancient and contemporary Native food systems that lasted for thousands of years without end. Everything from, we can see through fossilized pollen, how, for instance, chestnut groves in Kentucky were planted by human hands, because these chestnut, black walnut, and hickory nut just pop up out of nowhere in the fossilized record, and the fossilized pollen record, indicating that it didn't just naturally happen. Humans had a hand in creating this food forest, and it is sustained in the fossil record for 3,000 years without end. We also see these clam gardens in the Pacific Northwest, where with these human hands, we would augment clam habitat. And for one has, I think, 14 kilometers worth of habitat expansion on one of these islands. And these rock walls are 6,000 years old and were used up until the early 1900s. Also looking at the Chumash fishery, where we now call Malibu, California, where we know in the archaeological record, they were hunting sea otter, harvesting abalone, and fishing for 11,000 years straight without end. We also know in the Chesapeake Bay, where Washington, D.C. is, that folks oversaw an oyster fishery for 3,000 years that never had a pause. And we see when they deposit the oyster shells, how old they had been eating these oysters. And then within just 300 years, the American system has depleted the Chesapeake oyster population to less than 1% of its original. I really saw how, when the system is governed by certain values and principles, such as reverence, respect, reciprocity, that our systems can last for a very long time. And so it's not that humans are bad, it's the system, it's the value system that inhabits us can either be working or not. And so really this whole journey of investigation and study has led me to really look at our value system as the fulcrum point, as the root, as the magical place where all things kind of are either made or broken, And so it really was exciting to see that humanity not only cannot harm the earth, but can actually be an asset to the earth. Not only can we not destroy things, but we can actually, our very presence can improve the system, and even to the point of being a keystone species where we become a linchpin, a supportive asset that without us, some of the whole functioning of the system wouldn't thrive the way that it does. So that's just a little bit of my journey, which is similar to Riane's journey. And I often draw upon her work as inspiration to show, the Western Eurocentric domination system that says we have original sin, we're a problem, is often just an excuse for people to keep dominating, for people to keep harming others and saying, oh, it's just our nature, sorry, and saying, no, we can't use this as an excuse anymore. We have done better in the past and we can do better again.
I see a lot of yes, thumbs up. A beautiful, beautiful perspective. Thank you for that, Lyla June. I love that you brought in the word misanthropy, when you think of on an individual level up to a cultural level, the whole idea of self-hatred being toxic, it just kind of gives it a broader meeting. I love that we should look at the fossil record in terms of our systems thinking. I have to say, I hadn't really thought about that. Even in terms of looking at anthropology, the fossil record kind of has a lot in there, doesn't it? Whether it's a clam or an oyster. And then lastly, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, you used reverence, respect, and reciprocity in terms of the longevity of sort of partnership-based systems. And I just want to sort of put a pin in that because we're going to come back to why that works. Moving into the next question, Riane, a lot of your work is predicated on the idea of a hidden system of gendered values. And to be clear, we're not talking about biological gender here, but about stereotypical cultural classifications of male and female. And, you know, I've often wondered if by continuing to refer to traits as male and female, if we don't actually end up perpetuating these stereotypes. But that aside, I want to ask you more about what you mean by a hidden system of gendered values.
Well, thank you. And I do want to say that I don't use male and female in that sense, but I say stereotypically masculine and stereotypically feminine values, because as Lyla June said, it is really a characteristic of domination, what I call domination rather than partnership systems, to have these rigid gender stereotypes. And that is really a question of values, right? Because in a domination rather than partnership system, you do start with something biological, actually, which is the male and the female forms, which are two basic forms for humanity. I mean, we know now that there can be many people or some people in between. And the movement towards gender fluidity is actually a partnership trend, as is the movement of both the feminist movement and the men's movement, to challenge these gender stereotypes, which basically are damaging to both women, men, and everyone in between. So when I speak of a gendered system of values, I am describing what exists in the domination system, in which, starting with family, which, remember, I said that if you really look at our conventional social categories, since women and children were confined in rigid domination systems to families, they're marginalized, ignored. And of course, how can we even think of a systems analysis without taking into account what my latest book, Nurturing Our Humanity, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2019, questions this assumption using the latest findings from neuroscience, which is that nothing less than how our brains develop is not a function of either our genes or our environment, but of the interaction of our genes with our environment. And for humans, of course, we're back to the cultural environment. And I will get to the gendered system of values, because not only our domination systems, and I'll describe them very briefly and get to the gendered system of values in a second. The difference is really linking versus ranking, but there are hierarchies in partnership systems because power is defined differently. The term empowering, which, and I'm being nonlinear here, which is a recent term, isn't it? It doesn't belong with a domination system. It's another linguistic partnership trend. In hierarchies of actualization, in terms of the chalice and the blade, which is the title of my first book, bringing out these findings, which, by the way, is now in its 57th US printings and in close to 30 foreign editions. I mean, that book really has become sort of a minor classic. And I was trying to understand, and it was the first book that introduced the configurations of what I call the domination or dominator and the partnership systems. And it starts in families. We have to take into account not only politics, economics, religion, education, but families. Because as I started to say, neuroscience shows that families are our earliest environments, aren't they? And so the values that are transmitted in cultural values that are transmitted in families are fundamental. And there is a connection, if you have systems thinking, between the family structure and between the politics and the economics. For example, Putin in 2018 radically reduced the penalty for family violence. So if you hurt or kill a stranger, your penalty is more than if you kill a child or a woman or a man in your family. And that's because he gets the connection between family and what kind of, you're going to have a top-down family, or are you going to have a top-down state? And is it going to use violence or the threat of violence as part of the system? So I don't want to go overboard here, but to get back to the gendered system of values, yes, how a society structures the roles and relations of these two basic forms of humanity, the female form and the male form, is fundamental. And if that form is ranked one over the other, you internalize a model for all in-group versus out-group thinking, which is a characteristic, as we see all around us today in the United States, for those trying to push us back to more rigid domination systems. And yes, violence is not that partnership systems are completely non-violent, but it doesn't have to be built into the system. And of course, story and language are very, very important. So what we've inherited is this gendered system, not only of humanity, but of values, that anything that in domination systems is stereotypically associated with the masculine, with being a real man, domination, conquest of nature, right, is superior to anything stereotypically associated with the female form, with, quote, femininity, whether in women or men. I mean, women internalize this too, like they call sissies, soft, caring men, right? I mean, this is not a question of women against men or men against women, but we have a gendered system of values. And I'll stop here again because it was a lot of explaining to finally get to the gendered system of values, but I did.
Thank you. And as I hear you talk, it's like you can distill gender almost down to being a system of dynamics, where in partnership systems, gender is a linking principle that's inherently relational and inclusive, but in domination systems, gender is a ranking, exclusive, othering type of principle. And I also loved, as the mom of a kid who identifies as they, them, this idea of gender fluidity being actually a partnership trend. I just think it's a really interesting idea as we sort of engage younger folks in that conversation. Lyla June, I would love to hear your perspective, and to hear you talk about the perception of the feminine and the masculine within Indigenous societies, and then how they relate to each other.
Yeah, I liked what you said about how perhaps in a domination system, they'll use any difference to create an excuse for power structures, for power differentials, and how in a partnership system, differences are metabolized into strengths and metabolized into synergies. And I think that's how it is with the Diné culture. So my mother's people are the Diné people. We're also incorrectly known as Navajo. That's a colonial term. We call ourselves Diné, which simply means the people. And I'm from the Nanish-Ejitachitni clan, which I was supposed to say at the very beginning. We always introduce our clans when we speak, which I got from my mother. You know, we're a matrilineal people. We get our clans from our mothers. We get our last names from our mothers, not from our fathers. And again, that's not a power thing. It's more of a honoring thing of like, wow, we recognize we all come from our mother's womb to get here. That's the only way really to get here, unless they invent some kind of incubation thing, which I wouldn't be surprised if they try to do. But generally speaking, you get here from your mother's womb. And so so we are very matrifocal, matrilocal, matrilineal. I won't say matriarchal, because we're not in a way of women are on top. We're in a way of women are at the center. And the men have no qualms about this. That's one thing I love about Diné men, is they're very excited to honor women. They're very excited to follow the leadership of the clan mothers. And they don't feel threatened by that at all. They feel overjoyed to follow in the footsteps of our ancestors. And you know, these are big burly guys who, you know, have built me a hogan and have, you know, can move mountains, and they're overjoyed to put all of that power into the service of the clan mothers, and ask them, you know, what do we do? And they're very upset with this colonial puppet government that's come in, where every single one of the Navajo Nation presidents has been a male since, I believe it started in the 1950s, when this puppet government was installed into our community in Window Rock, Arizona. And the men of my generation were very upset with that. You know, they want to go back to matrilineal and matrifocal thinking. And we know that's the way of our ancestors, and we'd like to return there. But going back to your question of how do, in a Diné system of gender, as it were, how do we perceive things? And it's very fascinating, because we do not see men folk or women folk as higher or lower. We see them as necessary energies that must work together, and one will never be complete without the other. So when you look in the sky, the Big Dipper is the masculine constellation, and Cassiopeia is the feminine constellation. And in the middle is the Polaris, the North Star, and they revolve around the North Star. And the North Star is their central fire, their hearth, and they coexist together. And if you look at the Big Dipper, it actually is a phallus and a scrotum for us. And then the Cassiopeia, which looks like an M or a W, depending which way you're looking at it, is either breasts or a woman laying down ready to conceive. And so in some cultures, we'd be like, ew, why are you seeing, you know, male reproductive organs in the sky? And to us, we're like, why not? I mean, we see our bodies as so sacred that we believe we are kin to the stars, you know, like that our body parts are as extraordinary and awe-inspiring and as sacred as the stars themselves. And that they are so sacred, they work in unison together. And so we also see, you know, that these things are our guides of how the masculine and the feminine can coexist in the same sky and make everything more beautiful. So similarly, the masculine and the feminine they do have roles in Diné culture, and there is spaces for non-binary relatives as well. And it's sort of, that also is not put in competition. Those two can also coexist. Those aren't like, oh, you have to be hetero or you have to be queer. It's like they coexist together as well. And so one is not privileged more over the other. And so they also coexist. And so there is roles for all of that. And so the gender roles of the masculine and the feminine are certainly present, but they're not at the exclusion of special places designated for queer folk or non-binary folk. Everything is sacred, everything is honored. So the interesting thing about the women is when we have our first blood, our first menstruation, we have a huge 4-day ceremony where the whole community drops everything and celebrates the young woman for 4 days. And she runs a little bit each day, a little farther. On the 4th day, she runs as far as she can to the east and runs back. And she makes a big cake of corn cake that we bake in the ground because our oven is an earth oven. And at the very end, she gives it all away. And so we're teaching her that her power is in the strength to feed a nation. Her power isn't, we see her as a warrior battling hunger. And so our stirring sticks are our weapons, we say. And we are also warriors. And our warriorship is about having the power to nourish entire nations with just 2 stones, when we grind our corn, that you can feed a nation with 2 stones. And the menfolk help us with the corn planting, and they help to create the corn. And so we work together like that. And it's a symbiotic system. And we have stories actually of times when the genders did not get along and there was a separation and everything fell apart when they were, but then they came back together and they learned the hard way that neither is above or below, but they are complementary energies. So I'll stop there. I could go on, but
Right.
suffice to say that Diné system is very different.
Oh, so many beautiful expressions in there. I just have to kind of, call back some of them. You heard it here first. Differences are metabolized into strengths and synergies. That's just so beautiful. And power is the strength to feed a nation. There's an SDG answer. Right there. I just love that. I also want to say, I just heard it here first, matrilineal and matrifocal, meaning centered, not on top. That is just such a beautiful kind of, paradigm to think about. And then I think about how Riane talked about 2 essential bodies, and then how you moved into how bodies are really sacred as the stars. And I will honestly admit, I will never think of the constellations the same again after some of your insightful comments about them. So thank you so much for that. We're going to stay a little bit longer on gender, and I want to go back to Riane. So Riane, you have written that we have been programmed to marginalize gender, but that gender is a central social, economic, and family organizing principle in both partnership and domination-oriented cultures. One of the most interesting aspects of your research, at least to me, is that partnership systems and domination systems rely on the same foundational dynamics, the same drivers. And so I really wanted you to unpack that a little bit more for everybody.
Well, I will start really with the systems approach, if I may, because I drew from a database that is very different from the conventional one. First of all, it includes the whole of humanity, women, men, everyone in between. It also includes the whole of our history, not only the 5, 6, 10,000 years of, recorded history of deciphered writings, but the millennia, really, of our prehistory. And in doing that, we can really have a completely different analysis, can't we, of what is possible. Not and understand, by the way, some of today's trends. And of course, the third thing, it drew, as I have emphasized, from the whole of our lives, including our family and other intimate relations, which is very different from conventional categories and conventional studies, if you will, of society, of humanity. Now, when you do that, and I really want to refer back to some of what Lyla June was talking about, because there's so many commonalities. I mean, when I was a child, for example, I was a very curious child. And, you know, in the Bible, it says that henceforth, woman will be subservient to man. And I always wanted to know, what was it like before the henceforth, right? And of course, nobody wanted to talk about that. And I also was very puzzled by why woman, Eve, would ask advice from a snake. I mean, we don't usually do that. Well, it turns out that the snake is still in historic times, when you already see a shift in Greek times towards the domination system. It's a symbol of oracular prophecy. So no wonder. But I didn't have these answers until I really embarked on this research. Okay? And it became very clear that that story, the first part of the story, reflects, if you will, the old partnership reality. Woman, snake, I mean, even in, as I said, in historic Greek times, in the Temple of Apollo, there were pythonesses, priestesses, working with snakes to go into oracular trances. If you look at the Minoan, so-called goddess or priestess figures, they have snakes coiled around their arms, and they're in an oracular trance. So the first book, which is The Chalice and the Blade, and then my second book, Sacred Pleasure, really tried to answer the question that I was asking myself: how did we get to this place that we're in? And what I discovered is that it's actually a fairly recent development in the mainstream of culture, of civilization. And I won't go into that because I do want to get back to the cornerstones, to the relational dynamics that underlie both partnership-oriented and domination-oriented systems. And really, it's the partnership domination scale is always a matter of degree. I mean, there is no such thing as a complete domination system. There's, thank goodness, always people, well, who give even their lives because they don't agree with the system. And in partnership systems, yeah, we sometimes lose it. There is violence. There is some injustice, but it's not built into the system. And this takes me to the 5 underlying dynamics that are actually the same, but very different. I mean, it's the same dynamics, but they're very skewed into very different ways. The first, as I mentioned already, is in-group versus out-group thinking. In other words, difference is not valued. I mean, the valuing of difference, that's another partnership trend, isn't it? I mean, so, I mean, this is a hopeful analysis, both Lyla June's and mine, not a Pollyanna analysis, because we recognize that we are today at a turning point, really, where it could go either way. And it really depends on us, okay? On spreading this new view, which is really a very old view of human possibilities and of focusing on what has been marginalized. Because it isn't just race in the United States, it's in-group versus out-group thinking. In the Muslim world, it can be Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia. There always has to be an enemy, right? And the enemy is different. The second I've already talked about is childhood and family. We know from neuroscience, as I said, that nothing less than how our brains develop, and with it, how we think, how we feel, how we act, and yes, how we vote, is really a function of the interaction. You know, another distraction is this whole nature versus nurture discussion. It's an interactive process. You can't understand systems without understanding systemic interactions. And these 5 relational dynamics are all mutually supporting. Okay, so we know that the early environment and the trend towards the kind of partner of parenting today that is authoritative rather than authoritarian and violent, that's another partnership trend, fiercely resisted, right? But it's there. Gender, we're back to gender. We're back to the valuing of difference, beginning with this fundamental difference in form, is a template for ranking all differences, racial, religious, sexual orientation, you name it, in domination system. Whereas if you move more to the partnership side, it is more one of valuing these differences and accepting that, hey, we're not all the same. I mean, that's just how it is. And of course, economics, and we'll talk about that, because this whole argument about capitalism versus socialism and vice versa is another distraction. What we need, and we'll get back to that, is a caring economics of partnerism. That, and I don't want to go into that a lot right now, but we have really inherited an economic system of values that marginalizes anything that's coded feminine, okay? And of course, story and language. And we already have touched on that a lot. And the fact that we're recovering so much, I mean, like in Sacred Pleasure, I trace the remissing of both sexuality and spirituality from a partnership to a domination system. So what was once the sacred union of the divine feminine and the divine masculine now becomes a homosexual union between all male priesthood and an all male church, right? In a homophobic church. I mean, the whole system is lunatic if you really think about it that way. But that's what we've inherited, and that's what we have to not only deconstruct, but reconstruct.
So thank you. I really, I think it's so valuable to kind of look at those common drivers and really understand them in the context of what you call that interactive process, because that's so fundamental to systems theory, how the organism impacts the environment and how the environment then impacts the organism. And we can't lose sight of that. I also want to bring us to the ridiculous, and I don't want anyone to walk away from this very heady conversation forgetting that the iconic Riane Eisler asked the question, why would Eve ask advice from a snake? I just think that's really valuable as well. I love your humor, Riane. Thank you. I'm going to move to over to Lyla June as well, and bring it over again to the Indigenous sort of perspective. So Indigenous peoples have long known that peaceable, egalitarian-based cultures prevailed on Earth for millennia. You know, I think of Chalice in Turkey and Oaxaca in Mexico, and Riane, you mentioned the Minoans in Greece. In fact, domination-based societies really emerged fairly recently within really the last 10,000 years or so. And so, Lyla June, I want to ask you, what caused this regression in your opinion, and how can we reclaim a more interdependent, regenerative way of life?
Well, of course, I don't really know. I was not there. But here I do have some clues that I think are very fascinating and very telling. I know that, for example, Chaco Canyon is a very famous archaeological site in New Mexico, what we now call New Mexico. And Chaco Canyon was, a place where we had 5-story houses. Looking at the strontium isotopes in the logs of the ruins of this place, we can tell that these strontium isotopes match the same from a forest a couple hundred miles away. So what you have is in the year 1000 AD, people from what we now call New Mexico, my home state, hauling hundreds of thousands of logs over 100 miles away. And so that requires a lot of labor. And what I know from both my creation stories and archaeological analysis and our cultural narratives is that we had a caste system at this place. We were not your flowery, perfect, pretty Native American society. We had domination, we had slavery of sorts, and we had a caste system where the priests were at the top and the serfs, if you will, were at the bottom. And so this is interesting because we know through archaeological evidence as well, and through our own creation stories and our own narratives, that this whole place collapsed around 1100 AD. And it collapsed due to a drought. And we say, white archaeologists never ask us this, but we say that Creator sent us a drought as a gift to give us the courage to change, and different Pueblo and Diné cultures have different stories, but they all point to this. And many of us, we never go back there. It's very famous, lots of tourists go there, but we as Diné people, it's kind of taboo to go back there because we don't want to go back to that place, not just physically, but symbolically. We don't want to go back to that place of hierarchy. And now if you look at Diné culture, which we believe, and archaeologists argue with this about that too, but we believe that we are descendant of Chaco culture, Diné and Puebloan cultures, that the reason our clan system is so egalitarian now is because we have burnt ourselves in the fires of hierarchy and we know how terrible it is. And we are now, you'll never hear someone say, oh, Nanisht Ejit clan is better than the Kia'ani clan, or the Torachitni clan is better than the Hanagatni clan. You'll never hear us say that. We understand now that each of our clans is, again, a necessary element that synergizes, and our differences make us stronger. And each clan has a role, a part to play, a contribution to make. And when we work together, we are going to be whole and successful. And that was actually working quite well before the Spanish came in the 1500s and basically terrorized us, and because they themselves had been terrorized. And so that's not an uncommon story. The mound builders of the Mississippian cultures, who make the big mounds, they also had hierarchies. They were building those mounds, my Muskogee friend says, because they were trying to get closer to God. And the high priests would live at the top of these mounds, and all the lowerlings would live at the bottom. And when they finally reached God, God said, what the heck are you guys doing? Stop this. And they had also catastrophic events that destroyed the mound building societies, and they moved into egalitarian society. We also see the same with the Mayans. The Mayan folk, they actually voluntarily left, many of them, from their cities of hierarchy into the forest to a more humble, civil, you might say, life, where there's no high priests and low people and blah, blah, blah. They are a tribe or a nation of nations that voluntarily left their cities. Can you imagine the faith it would take to leave your system of hierarchy because you finally realized, I am not God? You know, that's what the Mayans did. So you got to kudos to them. And again, archaeologists always say, where did the Mayans go? Where are the Mayans? They never asked the Mayans. That's their story. We left on purpose. So anyways, point being, I don't necessarily know how we fell from grace, how we fell from our egalitarian nature into hierarchy, but I do know how we arose from the ashes. And a lot of indigenous cultures that we revere and we think are so cool, and don't get me wrong, we are cool. We weren't just born that way. We had to go through the trial of fire, the trial of hierarchy, and the trial of war to realize the value of peace. And that's what gives me hope for our current society, that we will learn from our unsustainable and unjust ways and arise from the ashes of those, which apparently always collapse, into a more wise society.
Yeah, thank you. So beautiful. Look, I think we have time for one more question before we get into the breakouts. I just wanted to highlight, something you said. We burnt ourselves in the fire of hierarchy. It kind of just resonates, doesn't it? And that the rising from the ashes seemed to be connected to realizing that one was not God. And so there's a lesson in there too, as we look at humanity today. So moving into economics, and I just wanted to briefly recap those 5 foundations that Riane spoke of. One was narrative and language, one was in-group versus out-group, family and childhood, gender, and economics. And so let's get into that a little bit. So capitalism, as we know it, is not working for most of humankind. It's certainly not working for women, for families, and for the global majority. So Riane, in your book, The Real Wealth of Nations, you write of the urgent need for a new economics that no longer marginalizes the work of care, which is coded as feminine in domination cultures. So can you talk a little bit about what this new economic framework looks like?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned The Real Wealth of Nations because that book really lays it out. As I said, the argument between capitalism and socialism is really a red herring. It's a distraction because both capitalism and socialism actually challenge some aspects of domination systems. Smith challenged the mercantilism of kings and so-called nobles. And then, of course, came Marx and he challenged the bourgeoisie. But they both perpetuated the hidden system of gendered values. So what we've inherited are economic systems, be they capitalist or socialist, as well as metrics such as GDP and GNP that fail to give value to include the 3 life-sustaining sectors: the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy, and barely really even look at the informal economy. It's sort of, which is largely, of course, women and peddlers and, people just trying to live on the margins. But this is a fatal flaw. And our metrics, our GDP, GNP, include as, quote, productive work, because for them, for both Smith and Marx, there was a distinction between productive work, which not coincidentally happened to be the work assigned to men in domination systems, primarily the professions, etc., factory work, etc., and reproductive work, which were these 3 life-sustaining sectors, because caring for nature is not even an issue in either capitalism or socialism, okay? Much less caring for people in households, which was relegated to be done for free in their time by a woman in a male-controlled household. That is the system we've inherited. And what I propose in The Real Wealth of Nations is that we need systemic change, systems change, starting with changing our economic system to recognize the economic value of the work of caring for people, starting at birth, this quote, women's work, keeping a clean and healthy home environment, which of course translates into keeping a clean and healthy planetary environment, doesn't it? I mean, it's all connected, interconnected. And when I spoke to the United Nations General Assembly, I made the point that you can't just tack on harmony with nature to a fundamentally imbalanced system. You have to excavate the hidden system of gendered values and then leave it behind, leave the stereotypes behind. And we are moving in this direction. And I know that we don't have much time. So I want to close with one thought. As I was listening to Lyla June, I thought, well, maybe climate change is sort of nature giving us a chance to really change the system. But you cannot change it. And I want to repeat this and repeat this and repeat this by switching from left to right or from right to left or from capitalism to socialism or socialism to capitalism. Look at what happened in the former Soviet Union. Look at, I mean, and really my books and my articles. And we do have a journal, the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies at the University of Minnesota, online, peer-reviewed, free. And I'd actually have invited Lyla June to contribute to that, because I think that the parallels between what happened in the Indigenous era for millennia, really, and what she describes happening in the Americas, they're just amazing. They're systemic parallels. So I want to stop with this, and because I know we have breakout groups, and I think that's very important. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Riane. And there is so much to delve in there. In the last few minutes before the breakouts, Lyla June, I would love it if you would talk a little bit about Indigenous regenerative economics.
Right. It's very related to the research about Indigenous food systems and related to everything we've been saying, that it's not an either or of like either humans thrive and the earth suffers, or the earth thrives and humans suffer. That is a false, binary. And the truth is we can all thrive together. And so the best way to teach that, I think, is through an example. One thing that we did in ancient time, well, not too ancient, 500 years ago, even as recently as 300 years ago, is we used to burn the land a lot. And I know that sounds destructive and scary, but what burning does, it actually tempers the land by turning all of these thickets into meadow. And the meadow not only spaces the trees out, so the trees have more room to breathe and more nutrients to eat and more water to drink, and they're not all competing and starving each other out. But that meadow also attracts deer, buffalo, antelope, other herbivores. And our burning was so important that many of the Midwest tribes and the Southeast tribes and the Great Plains tribes have a lunar calendar. And the September moon and the October moons were often named the grass burning moon, because that's how frequently we would burn, and that's the time that we would burn. And so a lot of people imagine us chasing the buffalo, hunting the buffalo with our bows and arrows and blah, blah, blah. But they don't understand that just as much as we followed the buffalo followed our fire, because our fire is what would open up meadow for them. And by burning, you actually turn those dead plant tissues into nutrient-dense ash, which feeds the soil system and actually stimulates microbial growth in the soils. It also ultimately, over many years of doing this, will increase the water filtration rates of the soil. It makes it more spongy instead of because you're creating this black loamy topsoil with ash consistently, all of those dead grasses being mineralized and put into the soil. So our burning systems, which were extensive, actually augmented habitat for buffalo and other herbivores. But in a regenerative indigenous economic system, you actually feed your food as much as it feeds you. So we were upholding our covenant with the buffalo. They fed us so much. We were wealthy in buffalo hides and all of the tools you could make from buffalo bones and all of the meats that was extremely nutritious and delicious. But as much as the buffalo we harvested, we helped sustain their families as well. We made sure they had places to go. We made sure they could travel easily on the land with our meadows. We made sure they had lots of yummy, nutrient-dense grass, which pops up in the wake of a prairie fire. And all of our medicines were pyroadapted. Echinacea, something that probably everyone on this call is taking when they're sick, is a pyroadapted medicine. It thrives in the wake of fire. And so that's just an example of a regenerative economic system that, the fire gives birth again to these really lush ecosystems. And so it's never an either or. We can thrive alongside our non-human counterparts. But I know that these breakout sessions are important, and we have some incredibly esteemed people on this call. I recognize some of the names and I'm Googling some of them. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you and everything that you guys are bringing to the table. Incredible work you all do.
Wonderful, thank you. So in the interest of time, Carolina, I'm going to just pass it right on to you to get us into the breakouts.
Thank you so much. Wow, this conversation has been profound. So many quotes and ideas that will stay with me for a very long time. And since we're going to post this conversation publicly, I hope that it will rapidly take over Barbenheimer as an internet meme. So many quotables and so many ideas whose time have come. So breakouts for 10 minutes. Actually, I think we should say 8 because we're running a little behind schedule. And we have an animating question for our breakout participants that it's not going to give, 8 minutes is certainly not going to do it justice, just as this, hour-long conversation is not justice to these ideas, but we'll get things started. And Carolina is going to move you into breakouts of 2 or 3 people. And the animating question that we'd like to share with you all is, based on what you've heard today and, acknowledging that there really hasn't been time to metabolize these ideas, though I imagine many of you are familiar with the work of both Riane and Lyla June, and if not, you can get more familiar with that after today. But what systemic interventions, based on the ideas that have been shared today, what systemic interventions might be the most effective in transforming our systems, given these truths and wisdoms that have been surfaced by these amazing women today? So I'm going to post that in the chat for you all to consider in the breakout. And I think Carolina can broadcast that again. But as you think about this from a systemic lens and perspective, what systemic interventions can unleash the power of our potential as symbiotic, interdependent civilization? So there's the quote in the question in the chat. And once we conclude the 8-minute breakout, we're going to bring you all back here into this main room and for some reflections and any last questions that we have for today. And so Carolina, I think we're ready to go.
Yes, we are about to open the breakouts. Enjoy the conversation, everyone. Okay, everyone's in breakouts.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all back here. We hope you enjoyed your very brief conversations around the prompts. And again, it feels like we could have parts 2, 3, 4, and 5 of this conversation, and maybe that's something we can consider because it feels all too brief today. But we're really, again, grateful that you've been here and participating, and we want to open it up now for some reflections and questions, anything that you'd like to ask of the speakers and the moderator. And what happened? As we welcome, sorry, I'm not sure what we don't know what happened. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge something before we go into this reflections and questions. I just want to say that the technology we have access to is marvelous in many ways. And I just want to say that our speaker, Lyla June, and our tech wizard, Carolina, have both been experiencing a number of challenges with technology today, and they have managed to power through, pun intended, and be present for this conversation and continue to hold this container for us and be here with us. So I just want to say thank you for adapting, and apologies to both of you that you've had to struggle so much and that you've maintained such graceful presence in the face of that. Now with that, we don't have very much time, but in the next 6 minutes, we'd love to hear from some of you with questions or reflections from the prompt. And maybe we can go over just a couple of minutes since we've lost some time. So we'll stay here for 5 minutes after the top of the hour. Please raise your hand. Yes, Karen.
Wait, your mic is off.
Yeah. Oh, you can't. Oh.
Wait, I think it must be you, Carrie, or Carolina, who needs to put their mics back on.
That's
Okay, let's try that.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you so much. I unfortunately joined this conversation so late because I was in a webinar myself. I have an organization called FemQ. Riane, I met you years ago in Chile at the Futures Conference.
Oh my goodness, that was a long time ago.
With Tsétsêhéstâhese, and yes. But why I wanted to join is because, and what's relevant is I ended up in the breakout room with Liz, and we were both speaking about domestic violence. And one of the things that I see, hear, and experience with FemQ, my organization, is when I talk about the feminine, firstly, mostly men don't show up for that conversation. But secondly, that recently in a body of work, and I'm getting to the question, when I was in Costa Rica, they were talking about the empowerment of women, an organization I was working with, and yet not doing anything about domestic violence. And I said to them, don't talk about empowerment of women, because when they stand up, they get beaten. And it's a fundamental practice in homes, especially in domestic, in particular, Latin America and everywhere. But I wondered, my question is to Riane, in terms of systemic change, which is what we focus on, is changing the underlying social norms and the system. In terms of domestic violence, these people that were working in the project said we can't do anything about it, it's a private matter. How can we change this notion that it's private when it's destroying the fabric of homes, it's destroying the fabric of communities, and people aren't speaking up and taking action?
Well, I think that we must show the connection of the system, that domestic violence is built into domination systems where women and the so-called feminine whether in women or men or anybody in between, is devalued and controlled. It's really, I think that more and more people are beginning to understand that gender is a primary social and economic organizing principle, and that it isn't just a women's issue or just a men's issue. And I think it's up to people like you, Karen, to really, really bring that message out. Because once you see it, it just hits you. You know, I mean, yes, of course, we have inherited a gendered system of values. It affects economics, it affects families, it affects our values socially, all the way from families to education. I mean, I remember waking up one day as if from a long drug sleep, and I realized that in all my years of so-called higher education, there had been hardly anything by, about, or for people like me, women. And so I worry about the conversation today about leaving gender behind. I think that we must distinguish between valuing difference, including difference in gender, women, men, and everybody in between, and the stereotypes that we've inherited and that we must leave behind for the mental health of both women and men and everybody in between and our culture.
Thank you, Riane.
Lyla June, did you want to comment on that before we move to Tanisha's reflection?
Just thank you for your question. I think you're so right. It's from a Diné perspective, or not necessarily Diné, but Coyote is the trickster, is one of the spirits that's turned against creation in some cultures. And they say one of Coyote's one of the most powerful tools is rape and domestic violence. Rape, because you can trick the woman into thinking she's worthless, she's defiled herself. If she blames herself, it's really challenging for her to have a good life, but she has to say it's not my fault. Then she can be free from that trick. And domestic violence, not only because of the harm it does to the woman usually, but to the little boy who is watching. It's just as much an attack on him because his design is to protect the women around him, protect the sacred. And so Coyote likes to taunt him, to torture him and say, oh, wow, you couldn't even protect your own mother. You couldn't even protect your own mother from getting beaten. And so the little boy who's watching, it messes him up so bad. And then he grows up to overcompensate. And so Coyote likes to jab at our very purpose, our very essence with rape and domestic violence. And that DV is just as much of an attack on the soul of the little boy who can't protect his mother as it is on the mother herself. So that's all I got to say to that. But just so agree with that, how important that work.
Thank you. Tanisha.
Yeah, thank you. I can't thank everyone enough for this wonderful conversation and the nuances expressed by yourselves, Riane and Lyla. So I come from a culture, I come from India, where the idea of male and female energies as being the central element of creation is the philosophy. And the true power of God comes from the equal combination of both. So I wanted to bring to the table a tool that is becoming popular, because I do think that as we move forward, that our main challenge is design. How do we design going forward without bringing with us all the things of the past? And so this new tool is called polarity management. The idea that there exist polarities which are dynamic polarities. They are not to be solved, meaning one polarity does not win over the other one, but that they exist in order to generate dynamism in the environment. So the focus needs to be on understanding which needs to be emphasized when, how the system needs to be guided from one emphasis to the other, and that the connection between the two is never to be broken. Thanks.
Thank you. Well,
Thank you, Tanisha.
I just want to say that India is so fascinating because, yes, there is that presence of at least some feminine energy, and yet in statues of Shiva and Shakti, she's half his size, and she, I mean, the whole thing is this mixture of the Aryan, Indo-European conquest of India and the indigenous people again. And it's up to us to sort it out. And it's also up to us to develop metrics. And we're developing social wealth indicators at the Center for Partnership Systems. But there's not much time, so I'll just throw that out.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And Tanisha, if you could share that work, that would be great. Share it in the chat,
I will.
please.
I will.
And I think, Riane, you might have just mentioned a teaser for one of our next conversations, the social wealth metrics. Oh, I'm afraid that it's time for us to come to a close. We could stay here all day, I think, all day, all night for the rest of eternity and continue to build the tensile structure that we are building here today, that we've begun to build here today, this connection, the connectivity, the shared awareness. And so on behalf of the System of Systems Thinkers, my dear colleagues, Carolina and Felicia, I want to thank you all for having joined us today. And again, I'm going to be rewatching this video several times, and it will be available for you to do the same. And again, I cannot encourage you enough to dig into some of the past dialogues we've hosted as well, and come back for the balance of this series, which will continue through the rest of this year. We have 3 additional dialogues coming, and we will be announcing the speakers for that soon. But we want to thank from the bottom of our hearts, Riane and Eli and Lyla June for today's conversation, setting the tone for our series this year. And we look forward to being in partnership with all of you going forward. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
It's been-
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you, Riane.
It's just so much, and I see familiar faces like Manuel, and so many of you. So bless you for joining.
And I want to channel, I think, Lyla June and just say, may the buffalo follow your fire. So, be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye, everybody.